Hello everyone and welcome to this Austmine webinar. I'm Sheldon Varco, Membership Manager in New South Wales here at Austmine, and I'm pleased to host today's webinar with Jackson McDonald on the future of meds. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Gadigal people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples attending this webinar. During today's session, you will hear from partners at Jackson McDonald, Tom Jacobs, Renae Harding, and Luke Paterson. They will deliver presentations about three key topics impacting Austmine members, including the new Security of Payment Legislation Act, the Work Health and Safety Act, and also a renewed focus on counterparty due diligence in an environment of continued disruption and change in supply chains. Following their presentations, there will be an opportunity for audience Q&A. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to send your questions over at any time. You can also upvote on other audience questions that you most want answered. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Tom Jacobs at Jackson McDonald to get things started for us. Welcome, Tom.
G'day, Justin. Thanks very much and welcome everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Justin. Before we get going, I'd also like to acknowledge that we're participating in this webinar on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So I'm Tom Jacobs, one of the partners at Jackson McDonald. My speciality is construction and engineering matters, and I've been assisting a number of METs, companies and individuals navigate some of the challenges that they face in the current times. My session, and I'm going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes or so, is about the building and construction industry security of payment legislation. I'm going to call it the Act, okay, because that's all a bit of a bloody mouthful, isn't it? This legislation is all about cash, okay, and I'm going to talk to you about why it is about cash. Obviously, cash is the lifeblood for most industry participants these days and always. So this legislation is changing, and there are some really big changes coming into effect, and those changes are coming into effect on the 1st of August 2022. And these changes, this new legislation is going to apply to every construction and engineering contract that's entered into after that date. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, why is that relevant? What does this Act apply to? Well, essentially it applies to every construction contracts. Those contracts can be oral contracts, or they could be in writing. And a construction contract is a contract, rather simply, to carry out construction work or to supply related goods and services. This legislation applies to construction sites located in Western Australia. But if you are an industry participant and you are supplying related goods and services for a site in Western Australia, but you're conducting that work elsewhere, your contract can nevertheless be caught by this legislation. And the important thing to remember here is that the definition of construction work is actually really, really broad. It applies to all sorts of engineering works. It applies to the construction and installation of all sorts of prefabricated bits of kit. I've had a bit of a look through the MET's membership list, and I've had a bit of a think, and I know a few of the members do the sorts of work that I've got up there on the slide. But if you are involved in things like designing or supplying mineral processing equipment, conveyors, plant, machinery, if you're involved in plant maintenance contracts, if you're involved in doing civil construction works like installing concrete slabs or doing some curbs or some roadways, or if you're supplying electromechanical equipment, you know, some of these magnetic separators for ion separation, mechanical systems to reduce emissions, or hydraulic systems into new mining or resource facilities, or control systems that facilitate the smooth, fast, automatic operation of all of those systems, then those sorts of contracts are probably going to be caught by this legislation. although it's commonly referred to as the Construction Act, the definition takes it very, very broadly. And it's not just bricks and mortar that we're talking about. We're talking about installing plant, machinery and equipment onto mining and resource sites in Western Australia. So this legislation is relevant for you, okay? So now that you know that, I'll just quickly touch on the fact that we do have an existing Construction Contracts Act. This applies to contracts entered into before the 1st of August, but this Act has a much narrower definition of what's construction work, and it actually expressly excluded all of this mining, processing and the fabrication of equipment that was used for extracting minerals and those sorts of things. And this Act did 3 things. It prohibited certain terms in contracts, it dropped other terms into your contract, and it introduced this really rapid process for getting paid called adjudication. But from the 1st of August, this new security of payments legislation applies, and it's probably going to apply to your contract. So what do you need to know? Well, it's going to make some really big changes to how you operate your construction contracts. And this is relevant if you are doing work and you're getting paid by someone up the chain, or if you are subcontracting certain obligations down the chain, and so you've got subcontractors submitting payment claims to you. I've got here on the slide the sorts of changes that this legislation makes. These are really very comprehensive. All I'm going to do is skim over these. Just to give you a little bit of an idea. There's a prohibition on pay when paid provisions. What that means is that I, as a contractor, can't say to my subcontractor, I'm only going to pay you when I've been paid. It goes a little bit further than that, though. It also says to the subcontractor, I'm only going to give you a variation, or I'm only going to give you an extension of time, or I'm only going to release your retentions or security if that is released under the operation of another contract. We can't tie those sorts of mechanisms in the subcontract arrangement to the operation of another contract. So that's pretty important. Time bars. Now, this is one of the banes of everybody's life. There are time bar clauses that appear in many, many contracts. I'm sure you've seen them. These clauses basically say, unless you tell someone that an event has happened that you think means that you should get more money or more time, if you don't tell them within a very short period of time and provide them with lots of information, then you can lose your right to payment. Well, those sorts of clauses may be able to be declared unfair. That's a real bonus for you. But also, if you're looking to rely on those sorts of provisions, you may need to think about whether you will be able to rely on them in future. They could be declared unfair if they're unreasonably onerous in terms of what you need to provide, and also when you need to provide it. You need to provide that notification very, very quickly. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, what if I just put a term in my contract that says the Security of Payment Act doesn't apply? We can't do that. The legislation has a provision that says you can't contract out of the Act. Retention money trusts. Now, I don't know if this is something that you're familiar with, but often on construction projects, a contractor will take a little bit of money from the subcontractor. They will retain it as security to ensure proper performance by the subcontractor of their works. And that money is then released at the end of the project. Well, retention money trusts are coming. They're coming in February 2023, and they're going to oblige the contractor to ensure that the contractor doesn't just mix that money in their beer fund, but they put it into a separate trust account where it's safe. So if the contractor goes bust, the subcontractor doesn't lose that money. They can get it back. So that's another good thing. There are some obligations that relate to commercial building contracts. Those construction contracts need to be in writing and contain mandatory information. So if you are a member that's actually doing civil works, or you're erecting dongas or those sorts of things, and those sorts of provisions may well be relevant to you. This deemed liability concept, that's something that's really important. What this legislation does is that it creates a statutory right to payment, which means that you have your contractual rights to payment, then sitting alongside that, you have a statutory right. Now, in order to engage your statutory rights, you send in an invoice, looks a bit like the contractual invoice, but this one you mark it and you say, this is a payment claim under the Act. And if the other side doesn't respond to your payment claim quick enough, then they are deemed liable to pay it in full. And you can go to court or you can launch adjudication to get paid quickly. Okay, so that is really, really a very important new statutory right that you are given under this legislation. It overrides your contractual rights. Really important. And deemed liability is a fundamental concept. What it means also, of course, if you are a contractor and you're receiving a statutory payment claim from a subcontractor, you need to respond. You need to respond within 15 business days, and if you don't, you have to pay that amount in full, okay? There are some other changes coming. I mentioned to you about retention monies. In future, contractors and subcontractors will be able to swap retentions for bank guarantees. Those changes aren't coming until February 2024. The adjudication process is a very quick and rapid way of trying to get your statutory payment claim enforced. It usually only takes about a month. Now, I don't know if any of you have been through arbitration or litigation. I'm sorry if you have, but you'll know that that's very expensive and it takes a hell of a long time. It can take, 12, 18 months to get to the end of that process. But adjudication is over and done within a month. And its whole philosophy is to protect your cash flow, to ensure that the money flows down the chain to the party that needs it in order to ensure that they are compensated quickly and fairly for the work that they have done. Because you all have your other obligations. You need to pay your suppliers, you need to pay your subcontractors, you need to go and buy that new sofa, whatever it is. You have your obligations, you need that money to flow quickly. And this adjudication process is designed to help that. There is another really important right. If you put in a statutory payment claim and you're not paid, then you have the ability to suspend work. Now, nothing ticks off a principal or someone up the chain more than you putting down your tools and saying, I'm not doing anything until you pay me. It's a very powerful leverage that you will now have under this new legislation if it applies to your particular contract. The final little blue slide there, prohibition on intimidation. Funnily enough, there's a bit of intimidation that goes on in the construction and engineering industry. People say, you're never going to get another job for me if you put in a statutory payment claim or if you take me to adjudication. Well, that sort of behaviour is going to be outlawed, and there are offences which bring fines for companies and individuals if it can be established. So all of this is a hell of a lot to absorb, I appreciate. It's coming in, and the government recognises that. These changes are coming in phases. The first phase starts on the 1st of August. At that point, you're going to get a statutory right to payment for contracts entered into after that date. There's those prohibitions on certain terms like the pay when paid and the contracting out. You get your right to suspend payment, and you'll also have an entitlement to a lien in relation to unfixed plant and materials. Phase 2 kicks in on the 1st of February 2023, and that's when the retention trust scheme kicks in. That only applies to contracts over $1 million, so they need to be fairly big contracts, but then come February 2024, that level drops down to 20,000. So the retention trust scheme from February 2024 will apply to every contract where retention monies are withheld, where the value of that contract is over $20,000. So you're a METS contractor. What do you need to know? You get a new statutory right for payment. If you want to exercise your right, you must endorse your payment claim. The paying party must send a response, a payment schedule, within 15 business days. You only have 20 business days to start adjudication. Your subcontractors will get similar rights, so you need to be aware of their rights and you need to be ready to respond. You may be able to argue that time bars are unfair. You get a new right to suspend work, and eventually you'll get a right to swap your retentions for bonds or bank guarantees. If you are a supplier, if you supply related goods and services to a MEPS contractor and you want to take advantage of these rights, your payment claim needs to be endorsed. It needs to say this is a payment claim made under the Building and Construction Industry Security of Payment Act 2021. Bit of a mouthful, but once you put that on it, you've engaged the Act. The other party has to pay in full, or they need to send you a payment schedule. If they don't send you a payment schedule, then you can go and enforce full payment. You get the ability to suspend work if you're not paid. You may be able to argue that time bars are unfair. So, a lot to absorb. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them now. Otherwise, do feel free to put those questions through to Sheldon. I think we might have a question in the Q&A. Are we able to click on that? We're trying to navigate our mouse.
You're right. There's a question there in the Q&A that just asked, is there a usual time frame for claiming the statutory right?
That's a really good question. Normally, your contracts will give you an indication as to when you can put in your payment claim, when you can invoice. And they may be every month or every 60 days or something like that. The Act essentially says you follow your contract unless your contract is too long. So if your contract says you can only put your payment claim in once you've done all of your work, the Act gives you the ability to put your statutory payment claim in every month. And that is regardless of what your contract says. If your contract says you can only put your payment claim in once you've achieved certain milestones, so you've put the slab down and then you've got some walls up, the Act says you can ignore that and you can make your statutory payment claim every month. So that's a really important question. Thank you for bringing that up. It's another example of how this Act is going to change the way in which you administer your contracts, in which you understand your contracts. Because even though you have these contractual rights, you now have this other layer of statutory protection or statutory rights that come over the top.
Excellent. Thanks a lot for that, Tom. And any other questions for Tom, as mentioned, please do follow up during the webinar or afterwards with myself as well. I believe we're now moving on to a presentation from Renae. If I can please welcome Renae.
We're just going to let the technology do the dancing.
Hello everyone at home or at work, wherever you may be. I lead the Workplace Relations and Safety team here at Jackson McDonald, and Austmine have asked us to proceed to give you a bit of an overview on the new work health and safety legislation that came into effect in WA finally on the 31st of March this year. Basically what the changes mean is that our previous safety legislation, which was 3 different sort of key pieces of legislation, have been mushed together into one mega act, if I can call that, which is the Work Health and Safety Act. And then that contains your key duties, and then the nitty-gritty details that you'll all be familiar with will sit within different sets of regulations. So we've got a general OSH regulations, we've got the mines regs, and then we've got the petroleum regulations. The dangerous goods regime still exists as it did previously. That is an entire mess in itself, so that the government's going to try and deal with that in due course. So that still does sit separately from this. I've only got a short time to speak today, so I just wanted to run through some key changes and to give you a bit of an overview as to what we're seeing with the courts and the regulator in this space, because things are certainly changing on the safety front on a number of matters, not just the introduction of this Act. As I indicated, the purpose of the Act is to consolidate it and to try and bring it in line with the legislation that we've got in everywhere else except Victoria. We are still different, though. We have some unique provisions, so we're not a truly harmonised system. But some of the key changes relate to terminology. So instead of employer and employee, we now have this term PCBU, so a person conducting a business or undertaking. Think of that as a business. So that's your business. If you're a proprietary limited, so you're a corporation, you're a PCBU. If you're a sole trader, you're a PCBU. If you're a partnership, you're a PCBU. And you, as that business entity, if I can call it that, owe a duty to ensure the safety of your workers. And so instead of the term employee, we now have a broad term worker that includes your contractors and your subcontractors, volunteers, apprentices, labour hire workers. So basically anyone that's doing work directly through you or because you've got some sort of contract relationship with them becomes your worker, and you need to make sure you do everything reasonably possible to ensure that their safety is not adversely impacted. There are some substantial increases in penalties, which I'll show you in the next slide, as well as a lot of media attention has been given to the new offence called industrial manslaughter. Basically, it's just a new sexy title that the government's given to it. We had the same offence in the previous Occupational Safety and Health Act, but we've just retitled it, and I'll give you a live example of what that looks like, which we saw being handed down last year. There are new obligations on officers of companies to exercise due diligence. You can no longer get insurance to cover any fines that you might be fined if you do breach the legislation. And then those who provide work health and safety services now have an express duty. So to the extent that you're using safety consultants, they've got some duties under the Act now. Up on this slide, I won't go through all of the levels. You'll see the new penalties. I've got in the middle column, that's the old penalties that were under the WA OSH Act, because we substantially increased those back in 2018, given that it had already been 10 years since everyone else was doing this work health and safety journey. They wanted to bring the penalties along. But you look at the very bottom row, that's the one that scares everyone. That's the headline grabber. You know, you're looking at a maximum fine of up to $10 million for a corporate PCBU, and for company officers up to $5 million, and potentially up to 20 years in prison. I do want to raise just the row above that, the death or serious harm one, and I'll have a look at this because not much is being said about this. And you'll see in that case, there's actually a potential maximum fine against an individual of up to $340,000 and a potential jail term of up to 5 years. And I actually think this is probably the more concerning risk moving forward, and I'll tell you why shortly. This is the industrial manslaughter offence. So basically what it is there's a duty to ensure safety, someone's breached that duty and someone dies. Where the prosecution can then prove that that breach was attributable to someone, in the case of an officer, neglect, consent or connivance, and that they knew it would be likely to cause death or serious harm, then that's where we hit that bar of industrial manslaughter. As I said before, this used to be gross negligence, and we had, I'm going to just take you through what it looks like now actually. Some of you may have seen this in the papers last year. This related to an incident that occurred down in Esperance, where a agricultural shed was being constructed on a farming property. This is a photo of a particular shed that was being constructed. On the day of the incident, there were two workers who were on top, doing the roofing on the top of the shed on the left there. One of the workers was situated at the very top, the apex of the shed, which was about 9 metres off the ground, and the other worker was at the edge of the roof, which was about 7 metres below. These workers were not hooked up. So there was no full arrest restraint equipment that they were using. There was no barricading, as you can see, around the shed. There were no scaffolds around the shed. One of the workers didn't even have a white card. The owner of the business, who was operating a crane, didn't have the appropriate crane licence for that crane. And on the day of the incident, unfortunately, a gust of wind came through and it picked up a bundle of the ColourBond sheeting that was on the roof that the workers were laying out. It picked that up and it pushed that bundle against the workers, who both fell off the roof. Unfortunately, the chap who was at the very top of the roof suffered fatal injuries, and then the chap who was closer to the edge of the roof, down the bottom of the roof on the left-hand side there, survived, but also suffered significant injuries. The company MT Sheds was prosecuted under the old gross negligence, so the same as what we now see as the industrial manslaughter provisions, and the owner, Mark Withers, the owner of that company, was also charged with gross negligence and pled guilty to that. He was found, obviously he was found guilty because he pled guilty, and at the sentencing hearing, ultimately, under the previous provisions, there was a maximum jail term of 5 years that could be imposed on him, and in this instance, the magistrate imposed originally a 3-year, 2-month jail term, which was then reduced to 2 years and 2 months based on mitigating circumstances. And ultimately, he was required to, and has now served his initial 8-month imprisonment term, and is now serving that 18 months suspended term. Now, Mr Withers was the first person that we've seen across Australia to have been sentenced and to have served time in prison as a result of breaching the safety legislation. Moving forward under the new Act, instead of that 5-year jail term, that you would be looking at a 20-year jail term as a maximum. So we can see that there's quite a significant increase to that. But as you can see, as I alluded to before, when we look at this concept of industrial manslaughter, there was a duty for the company to make sure that those workers were safe. They breached that duty by not providing them with full restraint equipment or providing barricades or a guarding around the edge of the roof. Someone died. And I can think all of us can agree that it was pretty obvious that by not providing those measures, that was likely to result in someone dying. So we're talking about the worst case scenarios here. We're not talking about minor safety breaches where these types of significant consequences can be imposed. With industrial manslaughter, moving forward, that's going to be something that the DPP prosecute rather than WorkSafe themselves. But WorkSafe can prosecute the new Category 1 offence, which was that one where I said where there's a breach of duty and that causes someone to die. So there isn't that extra level of recklessness or gross negligence that's required. And the important part with this particular duty is this applies to everyone. So it applies to your workers, and most importantly, where I think this will see the rubber hit the road moving forward is in the context of your supervisors. I think they're going to be on the front line because they're the ones who are going to have the role for enforcing your safety procedures and ensuring compliance with them. And if they don't do that, then that's where I can see WorkSafe will be focusing on people. And this carries with it, potential fines in the case of an individual of up to $340,000 and up to 5 years jail terms. So we've got some interesting times ahead. These are just some indications of some recent penalties that were being seen handed down by the courts, and as you can see, they continue to increase, and these will increase again under the new legislation. So that's some of the bad news. Some of the good news, look, your fundamental duties to ensure someone's safety hasn't changed. There's no earth-shattering changes under the Work Health and Safety Act in that regard. So whatever you were doing, if you were doing things the right way beforehand, you should be able to keep doing it the right way under this new framework. Yes, there's going to be some admin issues because obviously you're going to have to update all of your policies and procedures to refer to the Work Health and Safety Act, not the Op Safety and Health Act. And there's going to be some new changes in the regulations. And if you haven't started having a look at those, then I suggest that you do, because there are quite a few differences in the regs that we're seeing. For example, a lot of the regulations now aren't picking up Australian standards that they used to. So there are definitely different things that you need to think about and need to put in place. And that impact of the regulations is not yet known. Obviously, those are just coming into effect, and we're working through that with a number of different clients. I do think it's going to be important for businesses, particularly in the METS industry, to think about their supervisors, because you're going to need to think about how you can make sure that you're putting in place protections for them to do their job, because they are exposed to greater legal risk under this new framework. And in tight recruitment area, the tight recruitment labour markets that we're finding ourselves on, I'm sure that, you wouldn't be surprised to think that supervisors say, why would I do this if I'm going to be exposed to these penalties? So you're going to have to think about how you provide them with that safety and security for them moving forward. Practically, yes, there's going to be some high penalties. We're already seeing WorkSafe taking a different approach in terms of their investigations. Every incident they now have to investigate to conclusion, whereas previously inspectors had a discretion as to, once they've done some preliminary investigation, whether they need to continue it on or not. I wouldn't be surprised to see WorkSafe looking to prosecute all incidents, and they're certainly hiring a lot more inspectors as well. I think the trend we've seen in the past of small and medium businesses being at higher risk of prosecution is going to continue. For whatever reason it might be, you don't see many prosecutions of your RIOs and your BHPs. You see the prosecutions of the small and medium-sized businesses. And probably because a lot of the time the owners of the business are also, operational as well. So you're at the cold face involved in the incident. Another thing, just a tip, try not to rely too much on statistics. There's a lot of focus out there in terms of looking at lead indicators and lag indicators. Don't use those as indicators that your operations are safe. Yes, you have to get these stats and you've got to provide them to your workers' comp insurers, and they're going to continue to require those to work out your workers' comp premiums. But from a prosecution perspective, we will never ever ask you what those indicators are and look to use those to defend you in a prosecution. It doesn't tell you anything about whether you've got systems, whether those systems are implemented, and whether those systems are effective. And those are the three key things that you need to be asking yourself. So, do I have systems to ensure the safety of my workers? Are those systems being implemented? In the case of your medium to larger size organisations, you're going to be relying on your supervisors to do that. And are those systems effective? That's where you've got to be placing your focus. And that's where you're going to see traction in terms of having safe systems in the work. So that's a bit of a highlight on the way through. I can hold the questions until the end, Sheldon. So we might just shoot on to Luke now.
Ooh,
we've got a couple of questions, or would you rather us answer the questions now?
Let's go to Luke first, and then if we have time at the end, we'll get to the questions. Thanks.
Thanks.
Hi everyone, my name is Luke Paterson. I'm a partner in our corporate and commercial team here at Jack Mac. There's a bunch of different things I do in the transaction space, but also a lot of work around procurement, joint ventures, and supply chain. And to say that the last few years has seen enormous changes and disruption is probably a bit of an understatement. And I can't hear the groans, but I'm sure that you're going to groan and say, is this just another seminar about COVID? Well, no, it's not. But certainly, you look at the supply chain disruption that we've had as a result of COVID and as a result of a whole pile of other things like enormous government stimulus and the effect, sometimes unintended effects that's had on markets, labour in particular, some financial challenges in certain sectors. Building industry is one of the more public ones where we've seen some collapses. My favourite picture that made the world stop, but on a more serious note, I mean, logistics and freight costs have gone through the roof, and certainly the recent sort of lockdown in various ports in China has had a really significant impact on the cost of freight and how that and how our imported and exported goods get to us. On top of all of that, there's enormous inflationary pressures and the normalisation of interest rates that's occurred globally is obviously going to have a significant macroeconomic impact, but certainly at your business level, the cost of widgets, the cost of people, the cost of everything is increasing, and certainly in the press recently, the inflation rate in WA is higher than elsewhere. So these are all challenges. I mean, the good thing apparently in the US, there's some commentators that are saying inflation's easing, but who really knows? So I guess from our perspective, we're moving into a market where the effects of the pandemic are lingering, and perhaps the bigger challenges, some of the legislative and regulatory changes that we've just heard about, but also, digital transformation, a whole pile of other things, plus inflation, plus costs going up, plus, tight labour. There's a whole bunch of things that are presenting challenges. So from a legal perspective, what does that all mean for procurement? And certainly for us in the last few years, as you wouldn't be surprised, as you've probably been working with your lawyers, stuff like, how do we deal with delay? What's a force majeure and what's in and what's out? How do I deal with cost increases? So certainly the last 6 months, we've been doing a heap of work around rise and fall clauses, price escalation, who is in the best position in the supply chain to bear the risks of those things going pear-shaped. And then the effects of delay and disruption. So I mentioned freight before. I mean, there's a few clients that we've talked to that have had, such significant changes in freight costs that they have either pivoted away from their traditional suppliers and they've moved to suppliers that have stock here. So there's all of a sudden there's a massive advantage to those suppliers who have stock in Australia. Equally unrelated to this sector, but the work we do with a bunch of industrial landlords has seen enormous demand for much bigger industrial property, mostly because people want to onshore inventory. So all these sorts of things are drastically changing how you might go about procuring goods and services. And this is obviously an enormous topic, and we don't have long to talk about it. So there's one thing that does jump out at us, and it's often before we get involved, the opportunity to do supply chain DD is probably present and absolutely something that people in the Met sector will do. But I just wanted to bring it back to why it's important from a legal perspective. Our experience is that the typical legal remedies that you might find in your contract for when things go wrong, delay, disruption, etc. Termination, damages, LDs, suspension rights, all those things, they might give you a convenient mechanism to get things back on track, or alternatively get you some compensation. But they don't deliver to you the widget that you ordered on time and at the cost you ordered it for. Or the service that you engage someone to provide, whatever the contractual sort of context is. And that has brought about an increased importance around some proactive and preemptive responses to those sorts of risks. And that's sort of where we get to this counterparty due diligence piece. Before I get to this slide, I'll also mention at the end a little bit around the impact of decarbonisation. And I'll try and grapple with that with one or two things in 5 minutes. I know Austmine has a whole series on that, so clearly there's a lot to be said there. So this slide that I've got up here, this probably represents the sort of financial due diligence that you might do on your supply chain. And as I've said there, it's probably the easy one. It's probably the things that you already do when you're onboarding a particular vendor. There's nothing outrageous there. Certainly PPSR searches, credit checks, all those sorts of things will reveal potentially the extent of indebtedness. Publicly available financial statements. Dr. Google clearly provides a bit of an emphasis around what might be in the public domain, but certainly the challenge with all of those things is that they're looking in the rearview mirror. they're looking at what has happened historically. We've been working with a client who's grappling with a lot of procurement at the moment that involves really mission critical stuff, and they're looking at, you know, financials to, you know, at the end of FY21 and maybe some, you know, some management accounts to the end of the December quarter. And clearly that doesn't show necessarily how things are going to perform into the future. There's a whole bunch of leading indicators that might indicate some sort of financial trouble for a client, and certainly a lot of financial advisors we're working with are doing more analysis around what a balance sheet looks like. What does that say about the future? What does it say about the pipeline? How are the internal funding arrangements of these businesses structured? All those sorts of things. Now, certainly it would be foolish of us to suggest that that kind of analysis is necessary for every type of procurement that you do. You know, clearly there's stuff that is more fit for purpose than other things. And you know, bet the farm procurement will require that higher level of analysis. I should say, a lot of the time, you know, the publicly available information, you know, yes, it's useful and reliable, but they're all registers that rely on the right information going in. And if you're dealing with a privately held business, it's going to be very hard for what we've got up on the screen there to demonstrate just what kind of financial and commercial position your counterparties are in. So verifying some of that, you know, the low level stuff you could do could be to verify some of those things with procurement questionnaires and the like. And again, I'm sure a lot of you have done this, but I guess the point is, if you don't have a system for this sort of thing, you really need one. And the people that are doing it need to understand it isn't just a box ticking exercise. Have I got an ASIC search and have I verified that the directors are the directors? Yes. Well, you know, is it up to date? You know, are those people still involved in the business? All those sorts of things. There's a few extra steps you really might want to take. Obviously, you're also going to do a whole bunch of commercial due diligence, and I'm not going to certainly second guess how you might go about doing that. But again, bringing it back to the legal side, the point we're trying to get to here is that at the end of the day, the contract that you sign with your counterparties and right throughout your supply chain really needs to address all of the outcomes of your commercial DD. So you know, if you've identified that this particular supplier is absolutely critical to your business, and there aren't in the current market alternative suppliers that can deliver on the same terms, that is going to inform what sort of contract you have in place. And it's probably the case that your standard form contract to procure goods or services isn't going to do the job. It isn't. Don't fall into the trap of having done the commercial due diligence, understand the supply, understand that the key risks for your business, and then not translate that into the contract. We see that quite a bit, and certainly, you know, asking some important questions up front. What are the key risks? What does it mean for your business? You know, what happens if price goes up? All those things they've been addressed at a commercial level, but they don't often make their way sufficiently into a contract because sometimes you just don't have time. But I think, you know, absolutely it's you know, taking that extra step and working with your legal and procurement advisor to make sure that those key risk areas are properly addressed in the contract is important. Obviously, specification, cost, reputation, COGS and inflation risk, that we really want to talk a little bit about, and like I said earlier, we have been talking with clients an awful lot about the ability to pass on cost rises. How that's done really depends on the nature of the procurement and the nature of the contract. But clearly there's some challenges in the current market. I mean, we've tried everything from, you know, a price review mechanism that's the traditional rise and fall, or alternatively, you know, linking it to the extent we can to some kind of objective index. And while the you know, CPI is one of them, I think there's various components that are fast outstripping the inflation rate. So, you know, clearly the people that are buying goods and services, including you as a buyer, you're not going to allow a cost plus arrangement, but there has got to be something in between. In our experience, a lot of people are saying, I don't want my supply chain to fall over. That doesn't work. So that they need to have some sort of profit margin. And if they're operating at a loss, the services or goods we provide or they provide are going to be impacted. So I think turning your mind to those provisions is important. The other thing that I thought was worth mentioning here was, that you might do your financial DD, you might do some commercial due diligence, you might make sure that the contract addresses all the risks that you've identified in that DD, but still things are going to go wrong. And a lot of the time, people just want to be able to demobilise really quickly, and we're seeing an increased reliance on termination for convenience rights. So gone are the days of locking in a contract for a period of time, but now people want to give them the ultimate out in the case of delay, disruption, and change is termination for convenience. That's led to a greater focus on, well, how do we fund the demobilisation of a contractor? What does a contractor get by way of payment? What do we need to onboard either ourselves to do that part of the job or someone else? I think there's an increased scrutiny on that. So now, is that a reason not to do the due diligence and get the contract right? No, but it's a lever that you can pull in the mix of contractual levers to get out of a contract that is no longer working. The next one, I think, probably means a lot already to those of you in the seminar that are doing a little bit more on the technology side, but certainly, again, just sharing our experience, we're doing more work with traditional service providers and providers of equipment, where they're not just doing that traditional supply, they're also building on technology or software or things of that nature. And some examples will include, automation. The automation element of some equipment might require a software as a service arrangement or some sort of software license. Battery technology, the stuff that goes into a battery and how it might adapt and interface with everything else might require collaboration between a heap of parties and licensing of IP. And then the collaboration that is naturally required on the development of things like electrolyzers and everything else all the great stuff that this sector is doing. What that requires is, I think, generally two things. First is, obviously the contracts need to deal with it. Confidentiality regimes, bespoke sort of IP licensing regimes, and then into that, there's a little bit of, is there a restriction on who other people in the market who in the market you can work with? So if you're collaborating with one party on a particular technology, does that party expect you not to go off and compete? That brings in a whole bunch of real gnarly commercial challenges, but also, the anti-competitive conduct and all those sorts of things, which we won't get into today, but is something to think about if you head down that path. The other thing that it needs to take into account is if you are sharing, not plans and, sort of specifications and the like, but things that are very secret, highly confidential, include the personal or sensitive information of individuals or whatever it might be, there's an additional layer of diligence required on, well, what kind of cyber resilience do some of our contractors have? Now, obviously, this isn't going to apply to everyone, but it might be in certain circumstances necessary to have a look at the cyber security practices and cyber resilience of certain people in your supply chain. As we all know, that cyber piece really does rely, it all comes undone because of the weakest link in the chain, and certainly in a supply chain where you might be granting access to your parts of your system or through some sort of platform to others in the supply chain. That's something you need to think about. I should say that a lot of the time our experience is that the confidentiality and IP clauses traditionally, everyone's eyes glazed over a bit. And if it looked and felt like it said the right things, that was kind of, yeah, we're done. But in the examples I've just given, I think have a diligent interest in what the IP clause says, particularly if you're at the early stages of developing some technology or a great new idea. Obviously, probably don't have too much time to talk about this, but you've probably seen anti-bribery and corruption provisions, particularly if you've been dealing with large US and UK headquartered multinationals, and anti-modern slavery is a new one. I mention it because it's certainly something that is getting a greater focus, but certainly we could talk quite separately about all of that. In the very short time I have left, I'm going to tackle probably the biggest topic. So with apologies, I guess I just wanted to mention a couple of things about what decarbonisation means in this context we've been talking about, which is procurement, supply chains, and what your contracts might or might not say. Now, what are we talking about here? I think decarbonisation is obviously a real challenge for energy and resource intensive industries, but what is it that we're talking about? Now, all of you will have far better examples than I can give because you're living it. But waste energy and material reduction strategies, so doing what we already do but consuming less. A transition to renewable energy, obviously, movement away from powering mine sites by diesel towards gas batteries, solar, etc. And then logistics optimization. They're the sort of things that our clients are telling us they're doing in this sector. Everything from drillers to mining service providers and so on. And like I said, you'll all have far better examples than I. But there's two general concepts we just wanted to flag. And I think this topic will become, this first one around data, is going to become far more critical when a lot of large principals start looking a lot harder at their scope 3 emissions. So the indirect emissions that they make through their supply chain, everything that isn't their direct emissions or the emissions that are created from the energy they consume. So, we're starting to see a lot more, many more provisions in contracts which require people to report on those kind of decarbonisation things that I spoke about before. How much diesel are you using? How do you pay your trucks? What things are you doing in your business to decarbonise, etc. The challenge really is, carbon accounting can be a little bit opaque, hard to verify, hard to audit. The format of the data is not consistent. So you might have some upstream decarbonisation reporting obligations, but downstream through your SOEs and indeed yourself might find it hard to gather, store, collect and share that information. So certainly don't have all of the answers to that side of things, but certainly if you are agreeing to provisions in contracts which outline or broadly touch on decarbonisation and have reporting obligations, start turning your mind to what that means for data, and how do you measure your baseline, how can you measure improvements, etc. The other thing that's worth mentioning, and again, this isn't critical, this isn't a mind-blowing concept. Like anything in your supply chain, there are things that you will take and there are other things that you will need to pass on. I think carbon abatement costs and decarbonisation obligations absolutely fall into that bucket. So just like you might want to try and pass risk on to down your supply chain as much as possible, this is a little bit the same. And not to be cynical, but certainly, decarbonisation measures will come at a cost. And to the extent you're already struggling with spiralling costs, if you can push those costs upstream and downstream, that's fabulous. But if you need to bear it yourselves, then on what terms do you do so? So like I said, there's an awful lot we could talk about there. We're running out of time to do so, and certainly that's a really interesting topic, and what we're going to see increasingly in the market will require all of you to start thinking a little bit harder about what you do commercially and what you do contractually to address the decarbonisation plans of a lot of the big customers and clients we might have. So that's about it from me. Like I said, we could talk all day, but we might I might wrap it up there, Sheldon.
Excellent. Thanks a lot for that, Luke, and thanks to your colleagues, Tom and Renae there for those presentations. We are out of time, but I might just come to one quick question as we've had two people follow up with essentially the same question for Renae. So in the case of a workplace incident, is the primary legal responsibility on the business owner, or is it on the responsible health and safety officer at site?
It's on the primary responsibility. Everyone has duties, so I think it's a really good question. So in the context of multiple companies, all of those companies will have a duty in that space, and they can owe the same duty at the same time, and they can all be prosecuted for breaching the duty. In terms of the responsible safety officer, as an employee, obviously they're responsible for helping to manage the safety systems that are in their control, but the key duty is actually owed by the PCBU. So as a safety officer, internal safety officers they don't fall in that work health and safety services group that I was talking about, where there's a new duty that relates to where your business is, you're an external safety consultant business and you've got a duty in terms of the work that you're doing. So internal safety people, their duty just remains the same in terms of the same duty that an employee has to make sure they don't do anything to adversely impact their own safety or the safety of others.
Excellent. Thanks a lot for that, Renae. So as mentioned, that is all the time we have for today. So a big thank you to the team at Jackson McDonald there for your insights. Thank you to everyone in the audience for tuning in. You will receive a copy of the recording and any follow-up information this afternoon. But once again, thanks for coming along, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next webinar. Stay safe.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.